Last time on Dude, You Haven't Played This Game.
Mike? Maybe you heard of me as Mike Tendo? Dongled? Dude, you haven't played this game?
Never heard of you.
Never mind, I'll figure out my own way home. I bet you're wondering to yourself, how did he end up in an escape pod? Well, time to head home. But I have no idea how to fly this thing, so... Alright, guess I'll just hit this big green button right here. No, I don't want to talk about it. Hey. Policenauts on the Sega Saturn! Let's talk about that instead.
When it comes to North American video game history, it's easy to see why the age of the visual novel adventure game was on a crash course to obscurity back in the mid-1990s. Platformers, fighting games, and first-person shooters were all the rage throughout the decade. This led to companies like Sierra and LucasArts shifting their attention away from two-dimensional adventure titles and instead focusing on the up-and-coming popularity of three-dimensional graphics. But in Japan, the visual novel was still popular thanks to computer systems like the PC-98. Thanks to this computer system, along with the previous PC-88 line, visual novels and adventure games continued to flourish in the East, with dating simulators adding a flair of style in many ways. For a company like Konami, they knew deep down that the anime-style dating sims wouldn't attract as much attention in the West. Games like Tokimeki Memorial, a dating sim written by pre-Castlevania producer Koji Igarashi, or even development companies like Fairy Tail, who developed a violence and sex-infused visual adventure by the name of Dead of the Brain. On one side, you have romance and love, and on the other, sex and death. It was clear that these polar opposite extremes wouldn't have a place in a North American market. However, Eastern-themed visual novels and adventure titles weren't completely devoid of release over here. Somehow, gamers saw a surge of mature adventure games toned down a bit for a Western audience, thanks to the Sega CD. Mature games like Space Adventure, based on the anime series Cobra, and Rise of the Dragon, were obscure releases that didn't sell extremely well on a system that catered to a smaller market. Konami tested the waters with 1994's Sega CD release of Hideo Kojima's Snatcher, a cyberpunk-infused story where you take on the role of Gillian Seed as you investigate the murdering of humans by certain androids called Junkers. Kojima was a very unknown writer and producer in the West, with most of his acclaim staying within the walls of Konami via the Metal Gear series, Snatcher, Penguin Adventure, and more. Though Western audiences would get a taste of his talents, it wasn't until the end of the decade when Metal Gear was revamped into a fully fleshed out 3D stealth tactical action game, Metal Gear Solid. The series put Kojima on the map throughout the world, but before this, there was another game that was released on the PC-98 and was later slated to come out on the Sony PlayStation, the 3DO, and the supposedly definitive Sega Saturn release. There's a bit of confusion regarding an actual Western release of this game. There's evidence of pamphlets and brochures showing the game scheduled to release in October 1996, and even archive website info directly from Konami states that the game is coming out in 1996. The contact on the site is the senior production manager at the time, Randy Severin. However, Jeremy Blaustein, one of the lead translators of games like the Policenauts predecessor, Snatcher, stated that the game was never planned for release. There's also chatter that Snatcher was such a financial failure that Policenauts wasn't greenlit for Western shores. Whether this was swept under the rug or not, at the end of the day, the game was never released in any official capacity to Western shores, until fans translated it. We can go on for hours here about censorship between versions, Kojima's battles with Sony over certain female, physics, and more. But that isn't as important as our primary goal in this video. Today, we'll be deep diving into the world of space travel, illegal drug cover-ups, the ethics of organ harvesting, sex, love, and murder, all in the name of Hideo Kojima. This is Policenauts. Policenauts tells the story of Jonathan Ingram, a man who was part of a group of 5 policemen turned astronauts who were responsible for having a hand in the creation of a space colony by the name of Beyond Coast, or just simply Beyond. While up in space, there is an accident, and he is sent out into space, unable to save himself from his fate. Despite being presumed lost in space, his spacesuit isn't one of the normal sort, cryogenically freezing him. He is found 25 years later and revived. Though the road back to a normal life was rough, Jonathan Ingram returns back to Earth, now called home. He becomes a private investigator, sorting out all kinds of cases.
His previous life must have felt like a real glimmer of the past. A release like a sparrow into the night sky. Oof! I think I just killed the Hubble. Well, good night, sweet Hubble, and may a flight of angels sing thee to thy rest.
Ingram's adventures in Blade Runner-ish Depression Land come to a full halt when Lorraine, the woman he was married to previously, shows up at his office, of course 25 years older. She asks him to find her missing husband, Kenzo Hojo, and while he tells her he'll think about it, she still leaves him a few clues just in case he does decide to take the case. Smart move, as she is murdered within seconds of leaving his office. Thus begins our hard-boiled space noir buddy cop story. From the beginnings of the story, it had me hooked. I was fully invested in learning about the characters, the plot unfolding, and coming along for the journey of every twist and turn Kojima and Konami were ready to send my way. My experience with interactive cinema-style adventures is admittedly limited. I'd say the closest I'd come to these types of games was probably Capcom's Ace Attorney series on the Nintendo DS. It's not that I have anything against these types of games, they're just not my go-to for gaming goodness. However, what I would find in Policenauts would excite, entice, and enrage me, in more ways than one. Policenauts' story is unfolded through a series of first-person based questions and answers as you travel from place to place, grilling the characters you come across, using that information to uncover more story progression and game elements. The way this is done can be a bit repetitive, but it gets the job done. Kojima and the development team did a great job to make sure the player isn't venturing into a path they shouldn't be, and the story arcs are fairly linear in terms of the way things unfold. You'll move your mouse cursor with either the Saturn mouse or your controller's directional pad. When you move over each character before you, pressing the A button to trigger a menu will pop up and allow you to ask them about themselves, as well as the reasons why you are there or what you've uncovered, and how it relates to them. In most cases, you'll have to go over this information multiple times to draw out more and more information. I've never understood why this gameplay mechanic exists. Why can't you just give me all the details in one large paragraph? But then again, that's not exactly how conversations work sometimes. Anyways, you'll also be able to look at both the characters you're speaking with and the surrounding area, as well as show them evidence you've uncovered. Moving the mouse cursor to the outside areas of the place you're visiting and pressing the A button, Jonathan can either move to a different location within the area you're at or outside. There's also a system feature that allows saving, loading saves, light gun calibration, and more. Yes, you heard me right, you can play with the light gun in this game. Speaking of which, I found the light gun segments in this game unironically hit or miss. After calibrations, some of these parts of the game were fairly easy to avoid death. Most of the ones I came across in my playthrough were focused on taking out the man who was responsible for Lorraine's death, and later, when visiting Beyond, a chase through the highway and even a subway car battle. The models for the enemies in this version of the game were supposedly rendered with some sort of 3D instead of the traditional 2D style, making their target at times extremely difficult to hit with the light gun. I had to default to using the D-pad on the controller instead, which is never a good sign that the light gun is working, though I think it fared better in other parts of the game. There was one or two other sections, particularly late in the game, that was almost impossible to do with the light gun due to needing a quick trigger finger in a specific shot, so I ended up just switching to the controller. This is kinda disappointing to me, as I really enjoy light gun games and any excuse I have to play them on my CRT is welcome. Before anyone mentions it in the comments, the model of the Sony Trinitron I have completely supports light guns, so this wasn't the issue, and the gun works in other games. I think it had more to do with the efficiency over the style, in my opinion. It was just easier to move the narrative along by using the controller instead of struggling with game overs on a more prevalent basis with the light gun. Jonathan ends up in Beyond's police headquarters, where he learns that special mechs that look similar to his old astronaut suit are the ones who do most of the detective work around the precinct. They belong to the AP, also known as the Advanced Police. However, there's a section devoted to older-style crime fighting led by Jonathan's old Policenauts partner, Ed Brown. What follows is a tried-and-true example of Kojima's appreciation with film, where the entire game becomes an homage to the buddy cop movie trope. Jonathan takes on a very Mel Gibson-like Riggs role, with Ed filling in for the Danny Glover Murtaugh position. The two of them take on what ends up being a wild adventure that explores many real-world elements, much like Kojima's later masterpiece, Metal Gear Solid. Does that mean that this game is a winner too?
You know, I could really understand and empathize with Jonathan Ingram's situation. I mean, to have your whole world change. I mean, I went from eating 5-course meals to wolfing down these cherry fruit pies that I found in the back, along with these Mountain Dew Rise Energies. Product placement!
Kojima's strengths in storytelling lie mostly in writing really fun and engaging characters. The main cast doesn't get too big, with the 5 ex-Policenauts comprised of Jonathan and Ed, as well as now Police Chief Gates, Moon-based Security Chief Salvatore, and President of Tokugawa Industries, Joseph.
Wait a second, Tokugawa Industries, didn't they make Gray Fox's suit in Metal Gear Solid?
But it doesn't end there.
What the? Meryl Silverberg's in Policenauts?
Yes, Meryl was originally created as a character for Policenauts, but Kojima liked the character so much he introduced her in Metal Gear Solid as well. However, the two characters are only similar in name and some of their shared history. They are not one and the same. Meryl in this game ends up working on the Vice Squad with Ed, and a hamburger-eating fiend by the name of Dave Forrest. Dave's vest looked familiar? Yep, it's the one Meryl wears at the end of Metal Gear Solid. There's lots of little tie-ins and nods to other later Kojima games. There's a Snatcher poster on one of the walls, and even some of the same music makes its way back into later titles. Maybe this track sounds familiar to some of you. We'll get back to story and character discussion soon, but I gotta say, while we're on the topic, I absolutely adore the music in this game. There's a lot of movie-style cinematics from 80s buddy cop flicks and action movies in general, mixed in with smooth jazz and sexy saxophone, easy listening, 80s dance, ambient tunes, 80s synthwave, and more. There's even a whole subsection while you're searching through a huge stack of CDs, and you can play a track from every single CD. This actually took up a huge chunk of the game's data on one of the 3 discs that this game has, but regardless, it was worth it. The tone of a lot of the synths, the upright bass, the slinky strings, and stretchy keys are all here. Heart-pounding drums complete what is otherwise an amazing instrumentation by legendary Konami composers Tappy Iwase, Masahiro Ikariko, and Motoaki Furukawa. Just listen to a small sample of the incredible soundtrack and hear for yourself. The game was initially released on the PC-98, and while there were 3DO and PlayStation versions released, this version of the game is the way to go, thanks to the Sega Saturn having the same 24 frames per second for the animated cutscenes as the 3DO, though some would argue that these are a little grainier than on the PlayStation. However, the PlayStation version runs only at 15 frames per second for its cinematics. There's also a built-in glossary of some of the definitions that can be accessed in the systems menu on most screens by moving the cursor to the outside of the screen and pressing the A button. The game also features saving at any point in time, and a really handy recap option in case you need to remember where you left off when you start the game back up. Combined with some tightened up and extra scenes not featured in other versions, and light gun support, the Sega Saturn truly has the best version of Policenauts. I was lucky to get an extremely high quality reproduction in the traditional Sega Saturn English casing, complete with a repro of the original art book and all 3 discs, the manual, the soundtrack.
And I know it didn't come out here, but come on, a reproduction Toys R Us barcode SKU? Man, I miss Toys R Us. What's that? Looks like the Earth is approaching. Really fast! Where are the brakes on this thing? Yeah!
Getting back to the characters and story, there's a few side characters that become bigger players as the game gets going, especially Karen Hojo, Lorraine's daughter. She's suffering from a crippling disease and needs a bone marrow transplant in order to save her life. There's several twists late in the game that kinda had me rolling my eyes, but I won't spoil it for you. There's also the extremely suspicious Tony Redwood, who is a member of the Advanced Police Squad on Beyond, and a Frozener. A Frozener is a person that's artificially conceived with their bodies adjusted in order to live long-term in space. This falls back into not only Karen Hojo's disease that she suffers from, but a much larger problem. Organ donations are needed due to failing health of many people on Beyond, and the lists can be long. Part of what makes Kojima's writing style great is that he brings up topics of discussion that apply to real-world ethics, that really make you think during and after you set the controller down. I like the approach and world building that Policenauts features, and I'd say this game made me self-reflect more than any other of Kojima's releases. Also worth noting about Redwood is, similar to the James Cameron's Aliens movie, the character has white blood just like Bishop. Good old Lance Henriksen, I knew I could eventually work my love of him as an actor into a review. Now, I could go into greater detail about the rest of the characters in the story, or maybe touching on the ethics of humans suffering from living on other planets, but I instead wanted to pivot to talk about one of the biggest complaints I have with this game, and that is Jonathan's behavior and treatment of women. Now, I know a lot of people are going to roll their eyes or say that I'm making a big deal about this, but I'd instead like to offer my own personal perspective on the topic. During the game, you'll be inquired to ask about and look at characters. The most unnecessary and uncomfortable parts of this game involve the grab action. This is almost always an option when talking to females in the game, leading to Jonathan grabbing their breasts and making comments on them. Now, most would say, hey, this is totally optional, you don't have to do this. And that's true, except for one part of the game. A mechanical mosquito-like creature gets out of containment called a mosquito when you're talking to the head of the hospital, Chris. They play a bigger part later in the game, but in this part you have to repeatedly grope her entire body while trying to catch it. Some would argue this is to save her life. I would argue that there's better ways to go about storytelling than to have the male lead groping her. The only woman who doesn't seem to let you grope her is Meryl, but you have to beat her high score in a target practice session in order to do so. There's also a bit where Karen's in the hospital and, come on man, stop. Then you meet Ed's daughter and, dude, right in front of her father? Most women are just kind of annoyed by it. Some oddly open up and tell you everything, and others get fed up with it. But there are literally no repercussions for doing this. It's just there. Unfortunately, this is the internet, so I'm really not looking forward to the white knight comments. I'm not going to deny I like looking at beautiful women. I think most heterosexual guys would agree. However, I have always had the mindset of look, don't touch when it comes to my own personal history with the opposite sex. I've seen this behavior before in animes, and it kind of skeeves me out. And I've played other games where it happens too, and it just kind of bugs me. Raising 2 daughters of my own also adds to the importance of respecting women and their bodies. This sort of behavior, especially in a 21st century retrospective, is not cool, regardless of what region of the planet it comes from. I'm not perfect, but I can only just speak for myself. Though this feature was commonplace back during the 80s and 90s, playing the game today, I would suggest avoiding these interactions at all costs and just powering through the one scene that you have to endure it. I can appreciate the female form, but seeing someone be groped against their will makes the main character completely unlikable, though he has redeeming qualities later in the game. One thing that surprised me is that Ed eventually, and probably regrettably, joins in on this behavior, but it's clear Jonathan is more of a bad influence on him than this being his natural supernatural take on women. With 7 acts total, the game's build-up is mostly held during Acts 1 and 2. The plot sequence of Acts 3 through 7 end up being the height of the rising action, climax, and the incredible ride down through falling action in this tale. While there's plenty to discover throughout the adventure, there's certain parts of the game that really slow down the pace, namely the puzzles. There's a few puzzles thrown in to diversify the gameplay between hunting down clues and the light gun action scenes. So Jonathan and Ed are on the run chasing after the man who killed Lorraine, who has also been hiding the evidence behind the case left and right. After chasing him in a frustrating light gun car chase, then a heart-pounding train traveling section, you end up in a shopping area where he has fatally wounded someone in the cast. And so Jonathan, Ed, and eventually Meryl end up in this handbag knockoff store where a random woman is accosted and a bomb planted in her bag, which gets hidden with the knockoff bags. What follows is a game of find the bomb bag using, get this, a real version of the purse Meryl was given by Dave, who told her she wasn't feminine enough. Again, yikes, that would never fly in this day and age. Anyways, the bags are randomized each time you fail, but what really bothers me is the fourth wall breaking in an attempt at comic relief. The characters seemingly all die when you try to toss the wrong bag, but at the game over screen they make comments like, oops, better not do that again. For whatever reason, this really got under my skin each time, and took me out of the adventure during a scene in which this sort of fourth wall breaking is a bit inappropriate based on the severity of what was happening in the game. I just think it's the wrong part of the game to try to inject a humorous tone. After finding the bag, you then have to disarm the bomb. What follows is a series of confusing explanations on how to do this. You're supposed to move this magnetized tile without touching the border, but where do you have to drag it? Well, over here. Wait, huh? Wouldn't that set it off? Nope. There's also a section with wires that are extremely tough to follow due mostly to the size of the screen they give you and the window constantly refreshing as you try to dismantle it. This is something I failed at countless times. Then you've got to do the whole puzzle all over again. Ugh. Lastly, the Cayman list puzzle. Without the manual or a walkthrough online, you would not be able to solve this puzzle without wasting a significant amount of time. Basically, in order to access the data disk you find at the Hojo residence, you need to use his ID card in a specific computer along with this Cayman list's family crest. You'll be given the names of a family crest on the bottom of the screen, and it's your job to match them up with the ones that you see in the manual until the randomized code the game gives you is matched. This is really difficult to do without a walkthrough or a manual. Similar to trying to figure out the codec code for Meryl in Metal Gear Solid, which is in the packaging in the original game. It's long been rumored that these types of puzzles were created by Konami and Kojima to prevent piracy, but this is up for debate. Regardless, I think this puzzle in Policenauts would have been much harder than the Metal Gear Solid example. Moving away from the puzzles, I wanted to reflect on the pacing and functionality of dialogue of Policenauts. The game works best when it's trying to be a movie or a visual novel, but these extra bits involving light gun stages and puzzles, you know, the things that are actually making this a game, seem to distract from what I really care about, the story and characters. Each character has a unique enough voice, and rarely did I feel that the characters all rolled into one. Even when the unskippable Japanese voiceover dialogue is playing, I can still tell who's who, which is always handy. The dialogue, likewise, matches up and is attributed to each character rather well. The team who converted this to English did a fantastic job, and the twists and turns of the story are mostly intriguing and engaging, though there are some plot points that are just dumb. Making the end bad guy a potential savior of another character's life is a twist that not only comes out of nowhere, it just doesn't add up. This will make sense if you get to this part, as I don't want to give too much away. It left me rolling my eyes because they seemingly came out of nowhere, but in reflection afterwards, I realized there were some clues that were provided throughout the story here and there. I'm happy that there was clear character progression for Ed's character throughout the story, especially towards the end, and when that finale comes, it's an overly satisfying experience. Policenauts is a cryogenically frozen video game from over 25 years ago that, when thawed, clearly has flaws. The story does well by itself, referencing real-life scientific and space travel events, and works best when capturing the essence of its characters without all the gross pervertedness and sexual assault from its lead character. The exploration of hot topics like organ donation and harvesting, the effects of space travel on the human body, and the ethics of space exploration are all fascinating discussion points that really make the player reflect on real-world answers to these themes. Policenauts works best when it's trying to engage players with these types of topics, with stunning art all redone by Anime International Company, fantastic anime cutscenes, and deliciously smart storytelling to a point. Policenauts is a better story than a video game. I could do without the frustrating and overly complex puzzles that slow the pacing of the story down to a crawl, in addition to the now dated embrace of sexual humor that ranges from inappropriate to misogynistic. The game is capped off with an incredible soundtrack well worth exploring outside of the game itself. So the question is, should you play Policenauts? At the end of the day, I would say yes. I mostly had a blast with the story and enjoyed most, if not all, the characters, despite Jonathan Ingram's behavior towards women. I think Jonathan's redemption comes directly at the end of the game and the post-credit scene, which includes a revelation that, in my opinion, places the perfect ending to this intriguing story while also giving hope for Jonathan's advancement of maturity. The ideas proposed in Policenauts really made me think about life, both on Earth and beyond.
Well, it looks like we're about to crash land on Earth. Is this where I give my acceptance speech? No, that doesn't seem right. Yeah, we got movie sign!
Thanks to all Patreon supporters, but especially the Morningstar Whip tier and up. They are Sam Schaefer, Scott McElhone, The Autistic Gamer 89, Nintendo, Bryce, Derek Demitter, and Trevin Adams. Your continued support helps fund reviews just like this one, which would simply not be possible without the donations from Patreon members. I appreciate each and every one of you for continuing to help me make the content that you want to see. Classic, goofy YouTube video game reviews. If anyone is interested, just $1 down gets you access to exclusive streams on Discord, director's cut commentary for episodes, regular updates on upcoming reviews, and more. Check it out at patreon.com/dongled. I hate to sound like a typical YouTuber, but if Patreon is not your thing, but you still want to help to get the word out, share this video on social media, like it if you like it, subscribe if you're not. Exposure really helps, so if you like these videos and think your friends will too, sharing it with them means a lot. Want more Dude You Haven't Played This Game? Check out the videos enclosed below. You can click on the left-hand side or the right-hand side for a totally different but totally awesome review. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Dude You Haven't Played This Game.